Welcome back. It is 1 year since the 2013 general elections, and although many people have said we move on, the organizations which have been behind the scenes working to find the facts is the Kenya Human Rights Commission, which yesterday released a major report called Democracy's Paradox. The Executive Director Atsango Cheson is here to just give us a glimpse of what the Commission found out about those elections and the way forward. Welcome, Atsango.
Thank you, David.
And of course, I'm joined with my colleague, Mutegi Njau. Let's start from the beginning. It's been a year since, and people said we move on and forget about the things which went wrong and so forth. Don't you think a report like this is likely to revive issues or take us back from moving forward?
Good morning, David, and thank you. Good morning, Mutegi. Good morning to the viewers. I don't think we are taking anyone back. I think when you reflect, and I think a year is a good distance to sit back and just look. And when we look at when you look at the report, you will find that we actually don't only talk about what didn't work. We also talk about some of the things that also worked.
Yes.
Because as a human rights monitor, you have that responsibility to look at both sides of the coin. It's important to look at how things went, so that for the things that went well, you ensure that you replicate that. But for the things that didn't work, we also address those problems so that we are not consistently running into those problems.
Yes.
At the end of the day, what we want is an electoral process and system that works.
Yes.
It's, I think, in the interest
of
all
of us. If I may ask you, in a nutshell, what would be your verdict between the things that didn't work and the things that worked? What is your probability finding on a scorecard? Did things go more on the right side, or a lot of things went wrong?
It's a little difficult usually to answer that question in the positive, especially when you're dealing with something as complex as the process that we were dealing with.
Yes.
So unfortunately, if we were to look at it, I think overall we have a lot more things that didn't work than worked. I, however, do not want to put us in a situation where we're beating ourselves up. We also need to look at the context. This was the first election under the new constitution.
Right.
And therefore, I believe probably the most complex election in the history of this country. Okay. You know, maybe, you know, if you go back to the 1960s, that's the only time you'd find something equally as complex. Yes. Simply because you're dealing with a lot of new systems. Yes. We were dealing with a new electoral management body.
Yes.
We had gone from voting for 3 positions to voting for 6. So you need to look at it in the context of all of that, not, no, you know, not...
Yeah. And talking about that complexity of the election and the many electoral positions that to be contested, the IEBC is already working on a bill to isolate these elections, to have presidential elections separate from the parliamentary elections and county elections. Is that a proposal you, from your research, would support?
I think there would need to be some reflection. There were reasons why those 2 processes were, why all those processes were kept together. However, I do think that there will be need to examine and say that from a theoretical perspective, this may have looked like it was a good idea, but from a practical perspective, you know, there were challenges. But we may also need to ask ourselves, did those challenges arise because those 2 processes were being held simultaneously, or did they arise because of the fact that we had not put in place adequate preparation? And are they necessarily challenges that will arise again in the next election?
Right.
Yeah. Even if we separate them, is that still going to solve those problems? And I'm not so sure that you know, the issue was that we were having all those elections in one day. There were too many election
positions contested.
Who is the consumer of your report? Who is supposed to do a follow-up and implement that report, your findings?
So there are different aspects of it that need to be followed up by different people. We have recommendations that relate directly to the Independent Electoral Boundaries Commission, which we're going to share with them, and which we hope, because they were with us at the beginning when we set up our election monitoring unit, we hope that they will be able to follow up. There are things which I think civil society needs to reflect on, especially in relation to civic education. I think both the electoral management body, which is the IEBC, as well as civil society, needs to look at that, and all the actors that work on that, on that aspect of things. Then there are issues regarding the registrar of political parties, who, although they are affiliated with the IEBC, is a separate actor. There's even things which the media, we think, need to look at, and we had hoped, we did invite the Media Council to come to the launch, but I think also it was a little bit, there were, you know, we were not able to have the representative there, but
Yes.
we will again be sharing those findings with the Media Council, because there's a way in which the media approached this election that was different from previous elections, where we feel, I think, there needs to be an examination.
There was a lot of
and a
applause.
reflection
There was a
in
lot of
relation to
applause
that.
and commendation for the media, the way it handled that election. Is your finding different?
Our finding is slightly different.
What is it?
We feel that as a society, we were so committed to peace and calm. In part, you know, quite legitimately, given the violence that had occurred in the previous election, but to the extent whereby there were some questions which may have been uncomfortable, that historically our media was happy to ask,
yes.
but in this instance seem to have held themselves back from. So we think there needs to be an examination for the media on how to maintain that balance between promoting a peaceful process, but still asking questions that need to be asked.
Right, right.
On the day of the election, on the 4th, in the morning, right in the morning, in Mombasa, polling stations were attacked.
Yes.
And major media houses decided to hold that story because they wanted, the agreement was, let people go and vote. Because if we announce this, if we make this announcement that polling stations have been attacked in Mombasa, people will not show up. So actually the report, except in the social media, was delayed until maybe about 10 or whatever. It was, you think that was wrong?
Well, I'm not sure that is an instance where that was wrong. I do think that I think that choice made sense. But there were questions that were asked on the floor during the tallying process, for example, where sometimes we would not hear from all sides that were engaged in the process, or there were concerns being raised which would not be aired, which I'm not sure you would say would have the same kind of effect as that violence, for example. So those are some of the judgment calls that I think need to be reflected.
I do not know where you've gone up to or where you began, but if you remember, most of these preparations were delayed by Parliament. The previous Parliament delayed things because and changed many things which were supposed
to
to
suit themselves, especially running timelines by when they needed to do certain things.
Exactly.
Being political parties, submit names and so forth.
Yes.
To the extent that even that civic education could not be possible.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether is that
how did you what was your findings, or how did you find that particular element? We'll go to the other areas you sketch out, but just to respond to Mutegi's.
Okay, so there are issues which I think the political elite were uncomfortable with. Issues around integrity, the law on campaign funding and financing, which you know has only recently been passed, issues on political parties, and political parties themselves. One of the issues we speak to is the lack of quote-unquote political party hygiene. Which I think tends to be a very Kenyan phrase.
It is.
But things that had to do with how they manage themselves and their own accountability. Yes, I think being politicians, they were trying to keep in place the some of the freedoms that they enjoyed before, that were not in the interests of the public.
To preserve them.
Exactly. I, however, do think that we also had people who had new powers that did not understand or did not feel confident, and I am not clear as to why, to use those new powers.
For
example,
you
see the IEBC, you see the IEBC, the Registrar of Political Parties, the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, not
is it they did not know how to use those powers, or there was ambiguity around their powers? For example, I remember the interpretation of Chapter 6 and the role of the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission in enforcing that was left to open. In fact, parliamentarians just played around with it and said we remove this and the Ethics and Anti-Corruption reports are irrelevant. Whether they submit them, they do not determine whether you can run or not.
And this is where I'm saying that you also see bodies not asserting themselves, because the Constitution is clear.
They would have asserted themselves
Yes,
on
those
that
were
score.
opportunities to assert themselves. But if you remember, there were also moves with respect to the appointment of the relevant bodies. So there were certain bodies which normally would have played a certain role,
Yes.
which were deliberately, I think, to some extent, prevented from playing that role.
Okay.
We, at the time we went to elections, by the time we went to elections, for example, only had one commissioner serving at the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. I don't think that was an accident. I do think that the political elite could have
Did
earlier,
not want to
yes, done
give it
things in a
capacity.
certain way that would have ensured that we had that
Okay.
that body functioning. So I think we need to, and that's why we need to start looking at these questions this early. We shouldn't be waiting until 2016
Yes.
in order to address these kind of
All right.
these kind of questions.
We'll skim through all the areas you covered, but let me start from the top again. Why a democratic paradox? Why that title?
It's a democratic paradox because if you look, in theory, we had a lot of things in place to ensure that we performed better overall. So we had what we consider to be a sound theoretical framework.
The shell was there.
Yes, the Constitution was there, and it had addressed, because we have encountered these problems over decades, it had deliberately addressed many of these problems. But the enforcement, the implementation of all these processes we had put in place,
Yes.
was very weak, and that resulted in the paradox. So you have an electoral management body that ends up being put in place,
Yes.
because of the kind of deliberate delays you were speaking about earlier, too close to the process to enable it to actually do its work effectively.
Okay, that is it.
In your report, as you said, you haven't read it. Where do you place corruption?
Oof. We had footage of political actors, and we released at least excuse me, please.
Right.
We released at least 3 interim reports before this report came out, because we set up the unit in July 2012. If you go back to those interim reports, you will see footage, for instance, of candidates either dishing out money or having other people do it on their behalf. And I'm not so sure this kind of conduct applied only in relation to the general election. I think if you go back and look at the party nomination process,